Listen to AM 560 The Answer online at 560theanswer.com, on the AM 560 mobile app, on your Alexa-powered smart speaker, and on TuneIn, iHeart, and on Odyssey. Now, from the Signature Bank Studios, this is Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan Proft and Amy Jacobson. If you're looking for the latest news, insight into what it means, and the sharpest opinion, there's only one station in Chicago where you can turn, and it's this one. We're AM 560, The Answer.
Top of the morning, Dan and Amy. I'm a bit of a history buff, and I love the I love the war stories that we don't know. I love when they get told, whether in novel form or movie form. We talked the other week about the new Guy Ritchie movie, The Covenant, which is a fictional story, but it portrays a real thing, the relationship between U.S. troops in Afghanistan and the Afghan interpreters who worked for our government, worked with our armed forces in advance of their mission in Afghanistan. Unfortunately, the failure of the United States to keep its promise to so many of those Afghan interpreters. We talked a good bit about that with Dakota Wood from the Heritage Foundation, for example. I read a book recently about a paratrooper in World War II named Gene Metcalf. The book is called Left for Dead at Nijmegen, I think is the pronunciation. It's Dutch. My Dutch is a little rusty. But anyway, he was 82nd Airborne. He's dropped into Holland as part of Operation Market Garden. And if you know the history of Operation Market Garden, the planners of that offensive vastly underestimated the German presence. And once they realized they had, Gene Metcalf and others are sort of left for dead. They were assumed killed in action. But he tells his story as he ultimately is a POW before Americans free the camp in which he was being held and so forth. But I'm ruining the ending a little bit, but the story is worth telling. We've got another such story. It's a new book called Angels Against the Sun, a World War II saga of grunts, grit, and brotherhood by a paratrooper turned author, James Fenelon. James Fenelon he served in the U.S. Army for more than a decade. He's a graduate of the U.S. Army's Airborne, Jumpmaster, and Pathfinder schools as well. James Fenelon, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Good morning. Thank you for the opportunity.
So tell us the story of this World War II paratrooper unit known as the Angels that helped free the Philippines, a story that, again, like the story of Gene Metcalf, was not well known until someone memorialized it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you provided a great framework for us to talk about it. So the 11th Airborne, their nickname was the Angels, which was kind of a sarcastic reference to their unangelic behavior, if you will. These guys were 19 years old. The average age of the men in the unit when they formed in 1943 was 19. And, you can imagine young men looking for things to do when they're away from home and slipping the shackles of Army authority on the weekends and things. And so it was, a routine sarcastic question that one of the unit commanders would ask: how many of our Angels are still in jail this morning? And that kind of stuck, and that's kind of how the unit got its nickname. But it was in late 1944 that they shipped out after initially spending some time on New Guinea and landed on the island of Leyte, where they began their World War II campaign against the Japanese.
And you provide some details of what it was like to wage war in that environment.
Yeah, and I think that's a great way to frame it, because I think, before these guys engaged against the enemy, the Japanese in this case, they were at war with the environment. This was a jungle island. It had been raining for well over 30 days when they landed, so the mud was in many cases ankle or calf deep. Digging a foxhole in those circumstances was trying, because the walls kept collapsing on you. You always had a layer of mud in the bottom. You had disease, malaria, typhus, dysentery, things like that you had to had to be concerned about. You had insects, the heat, humidity. And so it really was a twofold campaign, if you will, one against the environment, the island itself, and then, of course, against the Japanese.
And we've had other books and series that have recounted how brutal the Pacific Theater was. What was the combat like in that environment for those paratroopers, the Angels?
Yeah, so it's these guys were kind of responsible for marching up into the central mountain range on Leyte Island. And if you imagine a long, kind of oblong shape, the central mountain range divided it lengthwise. And so the 11th Airborne was tasked with marching up in those mountains and setting up blocking positions up in those very small jungle trails. And when we say trails, these are like almost just animal footpaths kind of thing. It was impossible to get jeeps up there. And so what happened is these guys get up into the mountains, it really puts them in a position to where all of the American technology is negated. And so because they're so, alone up in the mountains there's constant cloud cover up on the mountains, so they can't really call in air support. The maps are literally hand-drawn in many cases, and so they can't call in accurate artillery fire. And so it really put them in a position to where it was, American light infantry going toe-to-toe with the Japanese infantry coming over the opposite direction. And so it really became a war of attrition where these two elements were just battling for supremacy of the high ground.
So you mentioned in your book that the war in the Pacific was so much more brutal than the war in Europe, and that plays a part in it. But what else is, the reason why you believe that to be true?
Well, I think, the Japanese, it has to be said, really, the Japanese Army really set the terms and the conditions of how the Pacific War was going to be fought. At this point in the war, in late October 1944, American media had well covered what had happened to the prisoners of the Bataan Death March. So, American soldiers on the ground were put in a position where they knew that they were going to be treated badly if they were captured. Of course, on the Japanese side, you had this effort by the Japanese leadership to kind of, take this idea of honor and tradition and the samurai warrior ethic, and they kind of wrapped it around, other elements of religion to really set up this no surrender, don't lose your honor type of mindset that in the Japanese soldier was kind of, imbued with this sense of if they fought hard enough and they fought, with honor and from their perspective that they couldn't lose, right, that their cause was righteous. And so that really kind of set this tone for the fact that neither side was willing to back down. One, because their honor was at stake, and the other was, from the Allied side, because they weren't going to put themselves in a position of being overrun or taken prisoner.
I mean, for those who don't know, I mean, the Japanese conquest of the Philippines was one of the worst military defeats in U.S. history. I mean, the casualties, there were something on the order of 20,000 American military personnel and about 100,000 Filipino soldiers who were killed or captured, right?
That's right. It was a major setback for the Allied cause. And, it started right after Pearl Harbor. The Japanese, of course, invaded a number of islands in the Pacific, Midway, the Philippines, and there was a protracted campaign as the footprint of the Philippine Army and the American Army on the Philippine Islands, shrunk and got smaller and smaller. And then, of course, most people are probably familiar with MacArthur and holding out on Corregidor.
Right, and then the cost that was paid to liberate the Philippines.
Absolutely, and that was one of those.
Can keep the mouth quiet.
Of the Japanese strategy was this idea of, well, if we can have one decisive victory over the Americans, we can come to the table on equal terms to discuss an end to the war. The Japanese never really kind of looked at it as getting better surrender terms. They looked at it as, well, if we can just grind the Americans down, the Allies down, we can get some favorable terms to how to end this thing and maybe keep some of the terrain that we've already gathered. And the way that manifested itself was these last-ditch, all-out defensive efforts to just make the Allies pay for every foot of ground they took. And you could see that, one of the best examples of that is, of course, on Iwo Jima. But that same level of tenacity occurred particularly in the battle for Manila, the capital city of the Philippines, which really became a, block by block, brick by brick battle for that city, which ultimately, sadly, resulted in over 100,000 civilians being killed.
So what was the fate of the Angels?
So the Angels, after the Leyte campaign, their next campaign was into Luzon, the main Philippine island where the capital city was located. They landed both amphibiously and then unique to their capability. They airdropped in a regiment of paratroopers as part of that push into the south city limits of Manila, pushing their way into that. After the battle for Luzon, the 11th Airborne were the first troops to airland in Japan. So they were flown from the island of Okinawa after the 2 atomic bombs had been dropped, and they occupied an airfield right outside of Tokyo and secured it for the arrival of MacArthur, who then several days later accepted the formal Japanese surrender on the USS Missouri.
I suppose the schooling you had in the Army and the schools you went through, Jump Master and so forth, you learn about these heroes from previous wars, World War II in this case, and that sort of informs the ethic of soldiers of today. Is that fair? Is that what the point of knowing this history is? One of the points?
I think you're right. I think the point of knowing this is just recognizing the capability. We tend to look at the greatest generation with a well-deserved sense of awe, but I think what really should drive that sense of admiration is understanding that these were 19, 20-year-old kids who refused to let their circumstances define them. Right? It was a case of you can't choose what happens to you, but you can choose how you respond to it. And I think that's one of the best lessons, in particular of the 11th Airborne history, is just how these guys came together. It would be an exaggeration to say that they all wanted to be there, right? That's just
Sure.
not true.
Sure.
But they continued to band together and do the best they could in the circumstances. Sometimes that's cracking a well-timed joke, and sometimes that's running out into machine gun fire to rescue a downed buddy.
Yeah, I mean, right. In an age where we have so many phony heroes, it's good to recall these stories and know these stories about actual heroes who served this country with honor and distinction. He is James Fenelon. He's a paratrooper turned historian, served in the Army for more than a decade, graduate of the Army's Airborne, Jump Master, and Pathfinder schools. The book, pick it up, Angels Against the Sun, a World War II saga of grunts, grit, and brotherhood. James Fenelon, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Dan. Have a great day.
Thank you. And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer.